Hello and welcome back to the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. I'm your host, Meg Carney, and I'm an outdoor and environmental writer and author of the book, Outdoor Minimalist, Waste Less Hiking, Camping, and Backpacking. The Outdoor Minimalist podcast has a goal to give listeners actionable ways to waste less hiking, camping, backpacking, and more during every step of their process. Your impact outdoors starts long before you hit the trail and goes beyond leave no trace ethics. You'll learn how to identify sustainable outdoor brands, how to ask hard questions regarding sustainability, and begin to shift and evolve your mindset to integrate minimalism into all of your outdoor pursuits. In episode 64 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we are talking about wildfires. And I'm really excited to share this discussion with all of you for a number of reasons. First, I have been wanting to do more ecology-based content on the show because I think it balances out a lot of the material production content that we already cover really well. Plus, it's super fun and interesting to learn about. Second, I'm stoked to say that this is the first episode intro that I'm recording from our camper van. Woo! If you follow me on social media, then you'll know that my dogs, Ash and Leo, and I hit the road about a week or so ago to do some traveling on the East Coast before we head back west. So if you're out east and have some hot travel tips, maybe some camp spots that we must stop at, or want to go on a hike, let me know. Anyway, back to the show. As we discuss in the upcoming interview, wildfires are a somewhat misunderstood natural occurrence, and they are often vilified in the media. So to explain why wildfires exist in nature, along with some of her personal experiences and observations, I had the pleasure of interviewing Robin Lee Carlson. Robin is an author and natural science illustrator. After studying evolutionary biology at UC Santa Cruz and the University of Chicago, she spent many years working on stream habitat restoration projects in California. She's most interested in how landscapes and ecological communities change over time, and her artwork is grounded in observing and documenting the world around her as it unfolds. Her first book, The Cold Canyon Fire Journals, was just published this year, and her work has also appeared in the Common and Arnoldia. Adventuring plans on your calendar? Remember to grab your Lava Linens travel towel on your way out the door. Founded by a mother-daughter team, Lava Linens crafts durable, luxurious travel towels as a more sustainable and better performing alternative to microfiber and cotton towels. Powered by flax and hemp, they're designed to be by your side for years to come. Use the code Outdoor Minimalist for 15% off your next order. Welcome to the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, Robin. I know that I'm already going to learn so much from this conversation, but before we start into the interview, I always ask my guests how they discovered their passion for wild spaces or how outdoor recreation and outdoor sports fits into their lives today.
Thank you, Meg. I'm so excited to get to talk to you on your podcast. I love it, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So it's funny, that question makes me think a little bit because, I've just been hiking and engaging with the natural world my whole life. So I don't really think of it as fitting in because I think of it as being my life in a lot of ways. And it's in a really low-key sort of way. I don't go out on big, extensive, long adventures out in the middle of nowhere. It's much more of a constant engagement with local natural areas near me or, of course I do travel and go hiking other places, but it's much more of just sort of natural daily life involves being out in nature and observing it. And that might be in a walk in my own neighborhood. It might be in a hiking area nearby, or, it might be several states away in a place I visit every summer. But I definitely can't imagine my life or the things that I've chosen to focus on in my life without the outdoors. And so throughout my background in biology and in stream restoration work for salmon, and now in natural science illustration and in documenting the natural world, that always involves being outdoors and engaging with nature.
Absolutely. And that makes a lot of sense how deeply integrated it is into your life because of your career and the path and everything that kind of led you there. So that makes a lot of sense. So let's get a little bit more background on that then. How did you get to the place where you are? And I guess now researching and studying different parts of fire ecology.
Yeah, so I started out planning on being an academic biologist and studying evolutionary biology because my main interest and all of my questions about the natural world are about process, about how things got to be the way that they are now and what that means for how we understand the natural world now. And so I was originally studying change in nature on a really large time frame in like evolutionary biology. And then when I decided that I didn't want to do academic research for the rest of my life and I wanted to be able to maintain a sort of a broader focus rather than narrowing in on super specific research questions for the rest of my life, I spent quite a while working on stream restoration projects for salmon and sort of exploring this shorter time scale change in nature in, trying to make streams healthier again for the salmon that need them and, what that also means for all of the other organisms that share that ecosystem. And so then when I decided that I wanted to change my focus and really explore communicating about science and nature visually, especially through artwork, which had always been, a hobby and something I had done my whole life, but wanted to try to turn that into my primary communication tool and become a natural science illustrator. I knew that I still wanted to focus on change in the environment, but now I wanted to make it be, really personally observing and documenting change. And so when I decided to do that, I was thinking about, what the options were for a project that I could start where I would go out to a place and sort of document it changing, probably following impacts of climate change or something like that. And so while I was looking for a topic, a natural reserve near where I live burned 2015 in a wildfire. And it didn't hit me immediately, but sort of slowly dawned on me after that here was the perfect opportunity to go to a place that was open to the public, that I knew I could visit regularly, and was also a place that meant a lot to a lot of people around here, and document it as it changed. So go there and just do field sketching monthly and watch what happened as it changed after fire.
Yeah, that's amazing. It just kind of happened in the right place for you, it kind of sounds like. And that study that you're talking about is also the title of your book, right? Cold Canyon Fire.
Yeah.
And so that project is really interesting to me, and the artwork in the book is amazing. And congrats on releasing the book this year, because it came out in August, I believe, right?
Yes, August.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll be sure to include links to Robin's website so people can check out her artwork along with the book if they want to have a little preview or purchase it. So since you were talking about the project and you kind of mentioned how it began and how it piqued your interest, can you also maybe discuss a little bit deeper of how the process went and really how it evolved over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a tiny bit about this natural reserve. It's part of the University of California reserve system, and this one is part of the reserves managed by University of California, Davis, because I live in Davis, and this is to the west of me in the Coast Ranges, and it's just this beautiful canyon that's got, some nice steep topography, and so there's a lot of habitat change within the canyon. There's sort of the main habitats are oak woodlands and chaparral. There's also grasslands and oak savanna, and then some nice riparian habitats along the bottom of the canyon. And so it works out great that it has, a bunch of different habitats all in one place. And so, the fact that, like you said, it just worked out perfectly that this project fell into my lap, because when it burned, it's in an area that, we do have, as in most of California, we do have a lot of fires now. And so there's a bunch of places nearby that have burned, but it turned out that this place hadn't burned for 30 years. And so that is sort of the bare minimum amount of time that's a fairly healthy interval between fires, especially in chaparral, which is one of the main habitats there. And so it turned out that what I would be seeing after that fire in 2015 was probably a pretty, would be following what the habitats there had evolved with to begin with. And so it would be a pretty healthy response to fire after that first fire. And so it was just this incredibly lucky gift to be able to go there. And so what I did was, to try to go every month and to spend whatever amount of time I had available to me to hike in the canyon. I brought with me a sketchbook and a pen and some watercolors or some colored pencils, and just kept my eyes open for anything that stood out to me as noteworthy. And I would draw as much as I could while I was there making observations. And then I would also take a ton of photographs so that I could draw even more at home, since there's only so much time that I could spend out there at one time. But just, allowing myself to just draw and make note of everything that caught my eye and sort of allow the different stories of things changing in the ecosystem to sort of reveal themselves as I hiked there and tried to remain as open as possible to anything that was happening.
Yeah, that's a really interesting process, I guess, for any type of project. I'm curious if you had a specific plan going in or if the general plan was just document what you see.
It was very much just document what I see. My biology background was not in fire ecology specifically, so I did not have detailed specific questions about fire ecology that I was expecting to answer right off the bat. I certainly had the overall understanding that these habitats have evolved with fire, and there's many strategies out there in the plants and animals and other organisms that live there for dealing with fire and for responding to fire, and varying levels of how much they even rely on fire, but that was all a very general understanding of that. I did not go into it with specific scientific questions at all. One of the other things that was attractive about the project, though, was because this is part of the UC reserve system, it is an area that is actively studied by scientists. And so I thought that would likely mean that there would be people I could ask questions of as I went along. Once I did start to develop some specific questions based on what I was directly observing, that there would likely be people out there who might be able to give me more perspectives and hopefully ongoing research projects that would also be yielding new perspectives as this place responded to fire.
Yeah, I can see how having those resources available could be really helpful for this type of project. And I find for some things in that realm, I've obviously never done a project like this, but sometimes I think it's helpful when I don't have a specific, I guess, knowledge or expertise in an area when I start just like looking into it or working on it and discovering it, because I don't have any biases and things like that. So I like that it was kind of a fresh look or a fresh take on this ecosystem and the fire and all of that. So while you were doing the project, did you find that obviously your knowledge of fire ecology was growing because you were just so immersed in it, but did it change or impact your general view of wildfires and what happens after it?
Yes, it definitely did. Doing the project meant that I was learning about fire ecology really by the end in three different ways. One was by this direct observation of seeing what I could see in this one particular place and one particular set of habitats, what I myself was seeing with my own eyes and watching happen over time. At the same time as I was doing that, from the beginning, I was also, reading scientific literature about fire ecology and learning more detail about the ecosystems there themselves too. And so I certainly was increasing my knowledge that way. And then especially as the project continued and I did start to make connections with scientists doing research and to get to go out with people in the field and to talk to them about the research they were doing, I was also increasing what I knew that way. And so the combination of all of that, especially the first two parts of that, mostly because those were what I was doing in the beginning and for the first few years of the project. I mentioned when I came into this, I did already know that, the habitats have evolved with fire, and fire is not, it's not something that destroys everything forever. But I definitely did have the overall feeling that I think a lot of us share, is that fire is still something that has to be recovered from, that it is still something sort of catastrophic and and tragic that happens to a natural area, that area then, we know it'll recover. We know it has the ability to recover and it has evolved to be able to do that, but still that it's something that has to be recovered from. And what I slowly, because it was definitely slowly, it's not something that jumped out at me from the beginning, but slowly realized is the ecosystems and the things living in them don't see it the same way at all. That this burning and recently burned landscape is just as ideal a stage of habitat for a whole bunch of organisms that live there, just as ideal as the mature, fully grown shrubs and trees, leafy and shady, as that stage of habitat is too. And it, often our perspective is, in modern Western society, our perspective is that leafy and green and shady and huge trees is the desired state. And that's what we're trying to get to. And we need to regrow from this burned landscape. And so I did finally realize that no, this burned landscape is just as beautiful because it is just as valuable and important and full of resources and wonder and beauty to all of these organisms that like that stage of the habitat best. And by the time the habitat has grown back to being leafy and green and shady, there's a bunch of organisms that have moved somewhere else because that's not where they want to live, because that's not where the resources are for them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective because, like you said, that isn't what we think of when we think of the aftermath of a wildfire, because we think of it, I guess, similar to a desert. We never think a desert is a really hospitable landscape for a lot of life, but it is, in fact, perfect for the right creatures and organisms. So you also mentioned that we see these wildfires as primarily the devastating natural disasters, which in a lot of cases they are. But during your project, what did you find is kind of the importance of the wildfires to those natural ecosystems, and how can it be beneficial to them?
Yeah, so sort of starting with the organisms that truly are looking for that kind of habitat. Just as an example, there's a kind of beetle that has infrared sensors under its wings that is drawn to fires and can fly 100 miles to a fire because it has detected the heat of it. And the reason that it does that is fire has either killed or weakened the trees and shrubs whose wood is where that beetle wants to lay its eggs. And so it seeks these places out because it can lay its eggs in that wood. The tree can't mount its own defenses anymore. And so that dead and dying tree is the ideal place for this insect and a whole lot of other insects to mate and lay eggs and raise their next generation. And so what that means is, first all these insects come, and that may not sound that exciting to us maybe, but the insects then draw things like woodpeckers that want to eat the insects. And so they also find the just burned habitat as this wonderful place of opportunities. And so there's just these sort of successive waves of organisms that are drawn right to these burned habitats. And I apologize because I started into that and I can't remember exactly what your question was.
Oh, no worries. You're going in the perfect direction. It's just wondering about what the importance of the wildfires is on the natural landscape.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I knew I was leading into it. But so you have these sort of waves of organisms where this is the most important thing to them. And so there's that first direct value of the recently burned landscape is opening up all of these pockets of habitat for things that want that habitat right then. But what it also does is the fire itself introduces, by burning the wood, it's breaking down the wood and putting nutrients back into the soil so that other plants and funguses and lichens have access to resources that had sort of gotten all bound up into the mature trees and shrubs in the habitat. And so it sort of helps keep things moving through the ecosystem in a way that nothing else does really in these habitats. And so without fire, you start losing some of these natural parts of the cycle of the ecosystem and how nutrients and other resources need to move through it. And it's something that, there's a lot of different plants that have evolved to need that cycling, and shrubs that eventually lose their ability to regenerate in a healthy way if they don't burn occasionally. And so there's just all of this sort of function of a healthy ecosystem that requires periodic fire, or else it stops doing what it used to do. And then there become more and more species that can't live in that habitat anymore because it hasn't had fire.
Yeah, I have heard of some pine trees that need fire or heat or a flame or something in order to drop their seeds. And I don't remember what it's called, but I have heard of that before. So that makes a lot of sense. And from my just basic understanding of fires historically, and even how fires are used now for conservation, they, like you're saying, they need to happen every so often. And maybe we used to use them a little bit more often, or other cultures even maybe used them more often in order to manage the landscapes. But how have our perspectives as humans about wildfires started to change over time, especially as we become more involved and integrated and encroaching more on the natural spaces?
Yeah, so Fire in the Western United States and in California especially, which is what I know the most about, even before any human habitation of this area, fires were, the habitats here were evolving with fire even before humans were here through lightning-caused fire and things like that. And so that evolution had already happened. But then when the first humans inhabited this area, they, through their own careful scientific observations of what was happening, could see how important fire was to the landscape and could also see how they could sort of help foster that relationship, use fire as a partner to sort of manage the landscapes in a way that they needed for their food resources, for their cultural resources, for building resources, for sort of every aspect of life. Close observation showed that they could help fire grow plants in a way that they needed them. And that also had the continuing value of maintaining biodiversity because these habitats had already evolved with fire. So there was absolutely this understanding that humans can work in partnership with fire to achieve what humans need for their lives. And then that also helps the natural world. But then with European colonization, then that was when fire was, Europeans excluded fire from the landscape as thoroughly as possible. And it was both used as a way to maintain control over the natural world. It was also used as a way of maintaining control over indigenous peoples too. Taking fire away was absolutely a tool of genocide and control in that manner as well. And so this recent exclusionary period of fire has been, as we are now starting to understand more fully, has had incredibly far-reaching ecological consequences. It has had also really important cultural consequences for the indigenous people that fire was taken away from, but it also has had all of these habitat consequences that have been building over time and that become clear because there are species that are on the brink of extinction simply because of a lack of fire. And then there are habitats that, when they do burn now, burn in a much less beneficial way because fire has been excluded for so long. And so there is absolutely now a growing realization about how important fire is, but we are a long, long way from fully rehabilitating the relationship that humans absolutely do know how to have. We just have forgotten this really important partnership that we could have with fire.
Yeah, do you know, what was the main motivation behind that historical suppression of the fires and how it has kind of evolved now with controlled burns and forest management?
Yeah, so there were absolutely multiple reasons for European colonialist suppression of fire. And some of it came just from because it was people who came here who had not had that relationship with fire, just being scared of it. Fire is really scary when you don't work with it regularly. And so there's that. And there's, as soon as you have more built up structures and cities, fire becomes a greater and greater threat. And so there was just that sort of, that fear that led to fire suppression. But also, like I mentioned before, making it so that the indigenous cultures here couldn't burn was also absolutely a specific tool of oppression in that manner too. And it was also, as more and more of the land was turned to agriculture. So it wasn't just cities, it was also agriculture and also wanting to maintain timber resources. Fire was a threat to all of those things too. So there were some very practical reasons that fire would be excluded then too. So, it was a bunch of things. And all of those things are still motivations. I mean, that, there's still lots and lots of uses of land that fire is a threat to now. And so protecting people's structures and towns, and I mean, we have to do that, we can't let cities burn, we have to do that kind of protection. But there is still at least now more recognition that we could have a better relationship with partner. We can manage land better, and that we should be, in some cases, as much as possible, returning fire to the people who know what to do with it and allowing them to manage land in the way that they should be and they used to be. And then also larger agencies being able to, use controlled burning in a more restoration and management sort of way. I mean, ideally that involves cultural practitioners, from tribes as well, but even when it doesn't, it still is good to get fire on the land one way or another.
Yeah, and I suppose now because we have so much property that we use and land that we use for, like you said, agriculture, and our cities are getting bigger, there's more rural living and all of that. So our relationship with fires, I feel like, hasn't really changed that much.
Yes.
But
that's right.
In other aspects of wildfires, how has human activity, other than like not controlling the fires, changed when it happens and how it happens?
Yeah. So because fire has been suppressed for so long, it does mean that fires can become bigger and more severe faster than they would have ordinarily, although there have always been large, severe fires, and those are actually just ecologically, those are really valuable too. What's different now is being in a period of drought, it means that, more may burn at once than might be ideal. And then, of course, because there are people living near all these wild areas and in the wild areas, of course we have to protect people, and of course we have to try to protect structures, but it certainly means that we have a responsibility to try to change our way of thinking about where we live, and if we are living in areas that might burn, how we build our structures and how we keep them safe so that huge amounts of resources don't have to go to protecting those structures, and so that the structures aren't lost, and so that lives aren't threatened. But yeah, especially with other aspects of climate change and drought and changes to the land, just because of that as well, fire is not ever going to lose these habitats need fire. Even in times of drought, we still do need fire, but how that fire happens absolutely is changing. Thanks to what we've changed in the land and thanks to what climate change is still changing.
Yeah, and since we're talking about climate change, we should just talk about how specifically the wildfires fit into that and why they fit into it, because I think you have expressed a lot of the reasons, like ways that fire is really beneficial, but most people, especially in mainstream media, we see it tied to climate change a lot, and we see it as this like big scary thing. And so I want to discuss that without being too doomsday-y.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so it's interesting. Fire is a scary thing. Especially on the scale that we've seen it recently. And I don't mean to play that down, but one of the hopeful things that I have learned in doing this project is our concept of these huge scary fires, when we just see pictures and read about them in the news, is of a sort of a different phenomenon than what is actually happening or what actually has happened afterwards. So, when you see a map of where a wildfire has been and you see this outline of the whole fire area, it's really hard not to think that everything in there burned, that you would go in there and everything inside that is this wasteland of stumps. And that's not the case. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes there are large areas that burn pretty severely and pretty thoroughly, and there isn't much left in that area right after the fire. But so often, and most of the time, if you actually go out and walk in these landscapes, there's this huge variation in how things burn. That is because of how the habitats evolved to regulate fire on their own. And that still happens even now, even with climate change and drought and all that. Different plants burn in different ways and burn more readily or less readily. And so that can really mean that there's this huge push and pull between how things burn, how the fire burns things as it moves across the landscape. And so if you actually go out in a burned landscape, you'll find pockets that didn't burn at all. And you'll find pockets that, were scorched by heat, but didn't burn very thoroughly. And so there's this huge mosaic usually within that fire perimeter. And so for one thing, it's not like all of that is gone. And for another thing, even when things look like they've burned really, really thoroughly, there's so much that's still alive there that we just don't see immediately. Underground, there are plenty of plants that have not been killed by the fire. Their above ground parts have been burned, but they're still fine underground and ready to return. They're surviving with their roots underground. Then there's plenty of seeds that often were waiting for the fire and are ready to regrow in that area. And so, I think the first important thing is really to just understand that it's not this absolute apocalypse out there after a fire. There's so much life out there, even immediately after the fire. And that's what being out there and actually experiencing it can really demonstrate. And then also, things will regrow. We often, I think, get this impression that this fire was so bad, it's going to be 100 years before anything even starts to regrow. And that's not true. It, of course, takes a long time to regrow large trees. And it also absolutely is the case that, especially when there are repeated fires in an area, the habitat that returns is probably not going to be the same habitat that was there originally. And that, of course, is a concern. Of course, things are changing because of fires and because of climate change, but things are going to regrow there. And I think because of how important fire is for these habitats, I think that the fact that there was fire there, even if the habitat is going to change, the fire still did beneficial things when it burned. And there are important things that it did in that landscape that we still want to have as those habitats regrow. I think just having this more nuanced understanding of fire and that it's doing important things in the world and in the landscape, even as it is also obviously a destructive force. And that, again, is all what it's doing for the natural world. This is outside of dangers to humans, because of course it's dangerous to humans. And of course we have to protect that and try to be better about how we build and how we live on fire-prone areas.
Yeah, and one thing that you mentioned while you were talking about all of that is that sometimes some areas, they can get overburned, and that can be detrimental in changing the biodiversity and the general ecosystem in that area. So when we think of this phenomenon of wildfires in climate change, is there a balance at all between the number of fires that are started naturally or that are human caused? Which I feel like in my head is a weird question to answer because climate change is influenced by humans. And so right. Does it make sense? Does my question make sense?
It does. I mean, because absolutely, because, some of it is our long-term relationship with Smokey Bear and this whole thing about, we need to be really careful that we don't start wildfires and we need to be responsible when we're out in the natural world. And I think that is important. I think unintentional fires being started, I think it's a valuable message for people to be very thoughtfully using the natural world as they are out in it. But I guess the other thing is, so we saw in 2020 a huge number of large fires started by lightning. So there are very large and catastrophic fires that were not started by humans directly. The lightning storms that started those fires, that was a very rare lightning storm. I mean, that may become considerably less rare. That probably is climate change related. So like you said, it's not like there's any way to take humans out of the equation. But I think also having the understanding that once a fire starts, it doesn't matter that much how it started. What really matters probably more is what the state of that ecosystem where the fire is burning was before. So in an area that has been in a prolonged drought, there might be lightning, it might be humans, might be a car's exhaust that is hot and touches off dry grasses that it's parked over. But how it behaves in that habitat, it doesn't matter how it started. The impact of the fire is much more determined by what has been going on in that area before that. And so in Cold Canyon, the place that I started studying in 2015, after a 2015 fire, so it burned again in 2020 in one of those lightning complex fires. So then that had only been 5 years between fires there. It had been 30 years since the one prior. 5 years is a really short window as far as chaparral is concerned for fire. And so that absolutely opens up a whole bunch of new questions about what that will mean for what regrows there and what might change in the species that live in the canyon. It won't be anything, it won't be a complete change right away, but there may be some gradual shifting in what plants and animals are there.
Yeah, I think that our cultural relationship with wildfires is strange just because of the education that we've had, and then how as humans we can now start to interact in a more healthy way with fires, and how it's related to the cultural implications around climate change.
Just returning quickly to that Smokey Bear image, we have started to move away from that, but understanding, because the whole thing, it is important to be responsible yourself with fire when you're out in the natural world, but the whole message of Smokey Bear that, every fire has to be put out because that's the way to keep the forest healthy, and that's the way to ensure this pristine wilderness concept that we have in our mind as the European colonist mindset, is to let that go, because fire is part of this healthy forest. And one of the most important parts of healthy forest management is letting fires that start burn. I mean, again, so this is not like people leaving unattended campfires. This is lightning strikes in the forest. We should not be trying to put things like that out, because that is how that ecosystem evolved. And that is a very healthy thing to have fires in forests. And sort of to address the questions about climate change and fire and what that means for moving forward, we have now some excellent examples of where federal management of forest has been trying to not have the smoky perspective and to let fires burn as long as they're not threatening any human habitation. So Yosemite has been trying to manage that way since the 70s, has been letting fires burn, has been doing controlled burning. The Forest Service has been doing that there for long enough that in a bunch of recent fires that burned in Yosemite, so some just this last summer and some in some recent previous years, like the Rim Fire, that burned in Yosemite and just outside of Yosemite where there's a lot of privately managed land, we can see in the larger patterns of how the fire burned that inside Yosemite, the fire does not burn uniformly over huge areas, but it does burn in the mosaic pattern that I was talking about. So it burns really thoroughly in one place, leaves other places alone. And so it has this patchiness that is excellent for recovery, because it means that species that can't handle fire have places to go and then return to the burned areas later once it's a comfortable place for them again. But it still has these areas with the more severe burning, so that the species that do need that have that as well. And so we have ample evidence in recent fires that managing differently and understanding that fire is supposed to be part of the regular life, the sort of ongoing yearly life of a habitat, we have proof that that helps then when we have some of these big fires that are certainly influenced by climate change. Fire is itself one of the ways to help ensure that we soften the blows of climate change.
Can you explain that last point a little bit more? How fire is beneficial to how we combat climate change or try to find a better balance in Earth?
Yeah, so areas that have burned more recently, so that haven't gone over 100 years without burning, places that have burned more recently, what that means is that the plants, especially that grow there, have had a chance to regenerate in a way that means that when they burn again, everything doesn't get completely scorched everywhere. It means that way, a lot of the drier brush, especially as shrubs grow, they end up with a lot of branches that eventually stop being green and growing and are still there and really are waiting to be burned. And if those are burned regularly, the shrubs grow more healthily. And then also there isn't all this extra dry woody material there. And so when that happens frequently, then that means that it doesn't have all of this dry stuff waiting to burn that makes the fire burn more thoroughly everywhere. And it sort of allows some things to burn and other things not to as much. And it also just means that there's a greater diversity of different types of trees and shrubs and other plants in the ecosystem. And that greater diversity, because everything burns in a different way, helps make sure that the fire moves through in a more patchy and mosaic way. And so for all of those reasons, if there are more regular fires, then each successive fire doesn't become this incredibly uniform force moving across and burning everything in the same way. Because then when it does that, then things often tend to regrow in the same way and you don't have as many different species. You have many more of the same species. And then when there's another fire, they all burn the same way. And it sort of helps perpetuate this lack of biodiversity in the area and lack of differences in burning patterns. And that just builds on itself over time.
Yeah, it all kind of comes full circle. The fires are helping contribute to the biodiversity of the area so it can have that healthy burn like you've been talking about. And I do kind of want to return to your project on the Cold Canyon fires. And it sounds like just through our whole conversation that obviously it changed your perspective on fires and fire ecology. But did it also influence how you now interact with natural spaces?
In slightly a less direct way, but a sort of an interesting thing that I've observed after doing this, how strongly I have come to understand that the recently burned landscape is just still this incredibly rich resource and is totally a beautiful landscape for that reason. When I'm out driving through, so driving in the Sierra through some recently burned areas, I still find myself having to really remind myself that this is beautiful. looking at a hillside covered in burned trees, it's still very hard not to have the reaction that, oh, how sad, look, all those trees burned. And to have to, tell myself, but of course, you know all of the insects and the birds that are loving it out there right now, and you know how beautiful that is. So it has been super interesting. Even with all of this firsthand knowledge, it is really hard to let go of these deep reactions that we all have to fire, because it is such a scary thing in our culture. Yeah, and as far as my own, how I actually interact with a natural area when I'm out in it after having done this project, I think it really confirmed things that I thought them, and I thought it would be a good idea, and it seemed good at the time. But just this whole idea of how much you can find in an area that isn't that far from home. You don't have to take a long trip to go somewhere that feels really exotic and different to you to learn a huge amount about the natural world and about what's going on in the world around you. This is a place that's familiar, that I've visited for most of my life. It's native species that I'm pretty familiar with, but still doing this project and being there every month and paying close attention, there are so many new things that are always out there to be learned and discovered. And that I'm just so incredibly grateful for having learned that and having that confirmed so dramatically for me that I can keep going there every month. It's been 7 years now since I started the project, and I find new and interesting things and have new questions to ask every time I go out there. And I don't think that will ever change. And I think it's such an important lesson to learn this, that we don't have to go somewhere that feels exotic and far away to learn new things every time about the world around us. And I think that's such a beautiful thing. And I think it's so important to know that we don't have to have these sort of big environmental impacts of lots of travel to feel incredibly connected and engaged with nature.
Yeah, it's a good motivator to have more micro adventures and use the natural environments that are in your backyard, because we've talked about this a lot on this podcast about how sometimes outdoor recreation feels unobtainable to some people and just not as accessible, because we think of it as we have to drive 3 hours or fly across the country to see this specific landscape and do this specific hike. And I like how you're talking about it, how you can return to probably even the same hiking trail fairly frequently and discover new things and have new experiences each time.
Yeah, and even to make it more local, it also has changed my relationship with my own neighborhood. So Cold Canyon, the creek in Cold Canyon, Cold Creek, feeds into a creek that then runs through my town. And so this is close enough that I have this direct stream connection to the place that I've been hiking in, and have this way of, even without doing more than getting on a bike, I can still interact with what is a connected part of the ecosystem and sort of keep asking these same questions here. And it's completely accessible and easy and still just, full of wonder and surprises.
I love that. Yeah, I love neighborhood walks. I think that they're underrated. Awesome. You shared a lot of really great insights, and I hope everyone learned as much as I did. And if people want to listen to more about your story or read about the project, see the artwork from the area, how can they find more information about you?
My website has certainly information about the book. On my blog, I used to post, I haven't done it so much recently since doing the book, but posting pages from my sketchbook as I did them. A lot of those ended up in the book too. But so there is a bunch of sort of information back through time on my website. And I also have an Instagram account that you can post along with this podcast too. And I post there regularly of, everything I'm sketching and thinking about along these lines. And then I also recently had a collaboration with Cal Wild on this fire mosaic idea, the idea of, how important it is to have these, varied burning patterns and have all of these different stages of recovery after fire. And so there's also information on the Cal Wild website about this concept and about this area, Cold Canyon. It's Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve is its full name. That's the UC Reserve, but it is also part of the larger Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, which right now there's legislation working its way through, hopefully to add on to that monument. And so there's a bunch of information about that too for people who might be interested on the Cal Wild website.
Wonderful. And I'll be sure to put the links to your website and socials, Cal Wild website, and then any of the other resources that you may have mentioned throughout the episode. But thank you so much for joining me today, Robin. It was awesome to learn so much about fires.
Thank you. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can still find me on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book for daily updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with a shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.